Hello, thank you for joining me on Humanities Radio. I'm Janet Cunningham with the University of Utah College of Humanities, and today, because we're in the midst of an election, we're talking about a few of the historical events that helped shape modern presidential politics. Eric Hinderrocker, Distinguished Professor of History, is with me to discuss some of these events, including the Electoral College and the elections of 1800 and 1824. Before we get into these consequential elections of the 1800s, let's first discuss the Electoral College because I think it's important to establish some of that background for some people who may not know. So can you just give a brief history of the Electoral College and why we use that rather than the popular vote?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think, the Electoral College is so interesting. It's such an important institution in the U.S. Constitution. And, people are often kind of confused, puzzled by why it even exists. And in fact, I think it's common for people to think, well, the founders must have had some good reason for introducing the Electoral College. In fact, the idea for the Electoral College came very late in the summer of 1787 during the Constitutional Convention. It wasn't even proposed for the first time until September. And it was proposed because people have been trying to figure out all summer long how to elect a president, what was a sensible mechanism, and they weren't happy with anything they'd come up with. The idea that was prevalent until the Electoral College was introduced was that the president would be selected by Congress. That proposal was actually approved in June by an 8-2 vote. But nobody really liked this idea because the problem with having Congress select the president is that in the constitutional system, the president's supposed to be kind of a counterweight to Congress, right? The president has the power of the veto. The founders wanted those two branches of government to be distinct, and they thought, if the Congress is selecting the president and the president is dependent on Congress and he's not going to be a strong independent force. The other possibility was to hold a national popular election. And they talked about this, but there were two main problems with just having a national election. One problem was that they were concerned that there would be candidates for president who would not have a national profile. And this is the kind of concern that doesn't make any sense today. But in the 18th century, they thought, if Massachusetts has some, John Adams character, and, nobody in South Carolina has heard of him, they won't really be able to make a good judgment. That is an issue that's clearly kind of gone by the wayside in modern times. But it was a compelling argument at the time that ordinary citizens would not really know candidates from other states or regions. And the second big consideration, which was really important for the southern states, is that if you have a national election for states like Virginia, whose population was 40% African American, or South Carolina, whose population was 2/3 African American, that would mean a large proportion of the people, of the adult males in your state, wouldn't be voters. So the southern states would be systematically disadvantaged because of their reliance on the institution of slavery as a labor system. It's kind of an interesting, problem. And so the idea of a national election seemed, basically like a non-starter. They also didn't want to give the power to make choices to the states. They did not want the president to represent the states. State legislatures were already selecting senators under the Constitution, but they didn't want state legislatures to have the power to choose a president. They wanted it to be grounded in a popular national choice. And so the Electoral College was this kind of brilliant last-minute compromise or last-minute solution, last-minute workaround, where you elect a group of people specifically for the purpose of choosing a president, and therefore importing the 3/5 compromise, which gave southern states more representation in the House of Representatives than they would have had if their populations were just based on the white population. It kind of imports the Three-Fifths Compromise into presidential elections. It also, although they didn't really talk about this in Philadelphia, because every state's Electoral College representation is a total number of people in Congress, it means that every state has a number of people in the Electoral College, the representatives plus the senators in the state. And over time, one of the things that has done is give small states a huge advantage over large states in Electoral College representation. This was not something they talked about in Philadelphia, but it's become pretty noticeable. For example, Utah, we have 4 congressional districts and 2 senators. So in terms of our population base, we have 4 representatives. But because you add the 2 senators to that, that's a 50% boost to the kind of electoral power of the state of Utah. California, by comparison, has 53 congressional districts. So they have 55 electors, which only boosts their representation by 3.7%, right? So over time, one of the weird kind of effects of the Electoral College has been to really strengthen the hand of small states in presidential elections, which, is something that might argue over time for rethinking the Electoral College. There's nothing about it that makes it that should make it sacrosanct. It was a kind of a jerry-rigged solution at the time, and in the modern era, it creates these kind of significant distortions, right? I mean, in the election of 2016, Hillary Rodham Clinton received almost 3 million more popular votes than Donald Trump did, and yet Trump just swamped her in the Electoral College, 306 votes to 232 votes. So, that kind of distortion reflects the kind of imperfections of the Electoral College system. And you could say that the old principle of one man, one vote, or one adult person, one vote, is not really being served so well anymore in presidential elections.
Just understanding the Electoral College, it is all very complicated, I think. And we could probably just talk about the Electoral College for this entire podcast. But instead, I think we'll go ahead and move on to talking about these elections and the impact they have had on current politics. So let's first talk about the election of 1800. There have been multiple elections throughout history that have had a major impact, but one of those was the election of 1800 and the creation of the two-party system. Can you talk about the significance of that election?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The election of 1800 was a really critical kind of watershed election. It was the 4th election for president. And just as you said, Jana, it's the election where partisan politics really emerged for the first time. It's also the place where one of the huge imperfections in the Constitution became apparent for the first time. Because the Constitution held that the president was going to be the person with the most votes in the Electoral College, and the runner-up in votes in the Electoral College was going to be vice president. And so in the first couple of presidential elections, it was a no-brainer. George Washington won the most electoral votes. John Adams was his vice president. And then in the election of 1796, John Adams ran for president, and so did Thomas Jefferson. And by that time, the opposition between them was beginning to emerge. So you have this odd situation in 1796 where Adams wins the presidency. Thomas Jefferson, who kind of ran against him because he was really emerging as the party system was beginning to form, and Jefferson was the figurehead of the Jeffersonian Republican Party that was developing in opposition to the the Federalist Party, Jefferson ended up being Adams's vice president, which is a little odd, but didn't cause, anything like a constitutional crisis. In 1800, though, the parties ran tickets for the first time. So Jefferson ran as a Jeffersonian Republican, along with Aaron Burr, who was intended to be his vice presidential candidate. Only for that system to work right, one of the electors who is committed to the Jeffersonian Republican Party has to vote for somebody else for, vice president, or there will be a tie. And that's exactly what happened. In the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied. And so even though they were both, Republican candidates, and the intention was that Jefferson was the presidential candidate and Burr was the vice presidential candidate, the election went to the House of Representatives. And what's really weird is that once it got to the House of Representatives, there was enough opposition to Jefferson that nobody really wanted to break the deadlock at first. And so you have this situation, there were 16 states at the time. Each state gets one vote in deciding between these two leading candidates. There were 8 states that favored Jefferson. There were 6 states that favored Burr. And then there were 2 states where there was a tie, and so there was no vote cast in either way. So Jefferson only had half the states. He needed a simple majority to win. Well, this caused a week's worth of debates in Congress, several dozen ballots, and there was just this deadlock. Jefferson had 8 states but couldn't get 9. Finally, there's some kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Burr supporters in Vermont and Maryland were persuaded to file blank ballots. They didn't want to vote for Jefferson, but they didn't vote for Burr either. But that was enough to give Jefferson 10 states, and he went on to become president, and Aaron Burr became his, rather controversial vice president. That election led people to realize that this was a real problem in the Constitution, and so the 12th Amendment followed, which modifies the way electors vote. And basically, among other things, it says that every elector casts 2 votes, one for president and one for vice president. And so kind of resolving that constitutional crisis, but also highlighting the fact that, when a presidential election gets thrown into the House of Representatives, it's kind of a case of all bets are off. Some people at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 thought lots of presidential elections would end up in the House of Representatives, maybe a majority. Fortunately, that has not been the case, because those elections that go to Congress to be resolved can be kind of messy.
So that kind of, I guess, leads us into the election of 1824 that was also determined in the House of Representatives, correct?
That's right. That's the only other one that's ever been sent to the House. Yep.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize. Okay, so that answers another question I had. I have no idea how many elections were actually determined in the House of Representatives. Can you talk a little bit more about the election of 1824 and that lasting impact?
Yeah, the election of 1824 was interesting because, I think you could say it really highlighted the fact that, people after the election of 1824, very clearly the expectation was that democracy should prevail, not some independent judgment of the House. This is one of the questions, if you throw an election, a close election, into the House of Representatives, is it the House's job to just pick the person that was most popular, even though they didn't win? Or can the House exercise independent judgment? And that was the question in 1824, because in that election, there were 4 candidates, and Andrew Jackson was the most popular one. He was a pretty controversial character in 1824 among the kind of, the Washington elite. He won a plurality. He won more votes than anybody else and got 99 Electoral College votes. And the runner-up was John Quincy Adams, son of the second president of the United States, and somebody with, a lot of people would say much better credentials than Andrew Jackson. John Quincy Adams was the runner-up with 85 votes. And then there were two other candidates. William Crawford had 41 votes, and the candidate who was a distant fourth with 37 Electoral College votes was Henry Clay, who happened to be the Speaker of the House, the guy that ran the business of the House of Representatives, which is where the election was thrown to when nobody won a majority of the Electoral College votes. So the House debated on this topic, and under Henry Clay's leadership chose John Quincy Adams as the next president of the United States over Andrew Jackson. And then Adams turned around and nominated Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. And so Andrew Jackson called this a corrupt bargain. He said, look, obviously there was backroom dealing. They, squeezed me out. This is a couple of Washington insiders scratching each other's back. And this became, his kind of rallying cry for the next 4 years until the election of 1828, when he did win the popular vote. And John Quincy Adams ended up being a one-term president who was swamped by Jackson in the subsequent presidential election. So they're kind of an interesting. That's a particularly interesting case because it's not clear that Henry Clay or anybody in the House of Representatives felt like they had any obligation to select Jackson just because he was the popular choice. They felt like they were the wise men sitting in the House of Representatives and they could act on their own judgment. And Jackson pretty clearly proved them wrong on that point in the long run.
It's so interesting to learn about these elections because, each election seems like it gets more and more complicated, but unless you know kind of historically, it seems like all of the elections have just been as complicated or they just as the next. Is that fair to say? None of these elections really ever seem straightforward.
It really is true. The process of organizing an election on a national scale is kind of really fraught. Donald Trump is making a big deal this year about how we should be prepared to mistrust the results of this election, right? But the truth is that our electoral system runs on trust. It's very decentralized. The national government doesn't run anything with respect to elections, right? They're all conducted at the state and local level. So there's not one national system for elections. There's 50 systems. And, more than that, if you include the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, so this is, you could argue that this is a strength of the American system, right? That kind of decentralized control makes it much harder for bad actors to manipulate the outcome of these elections. On the other hand, it means there's a lot more variables in play. And so just as you say, Jenna, the results can be really confusing sometimes. It's not that long ago. Many of us still remember the election of 2000 when the results of the election in Florida were contested. This was the Bush versus Gore election of 2000. Results in Florida were contested, and the presidency hung in the balance. And the Supreme Court of the United States ultimately ended up finding in favor, of a Republican victory, a victory for Bush in Florida, which gave Bush the presidency. But we all had to wait around for a while for the Supreme Court to rule on this, this election outcome in this one large and important southern state. It's a little bit too like, another example of this. There's one other time when Congress has decided the outcome of a presidential election, and that's different from an election being thrown into the House. But in 1870, at the election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican candidate. Samuel Tilden was the Democrat. And Tilden ended up winning both the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, but there was a controversy over the election results in 3 southern states. This was in 1876. It was a decade after the end of the Civil War. The southern states had been occupied by federal troops, and they had to re-qualify for membership in the Union one by one. And there were 2 different electoral results reported in 3 states. So originally, what was counted were Democratic victory in those 3 states. Republicans challenged those outcomes, and so Congress has to decide disputed elections. Congress, the House plus the Senate, and so in order to decide this disputed election, because those 3 states had enough electoral votes that the election hung in the balance, the Congress created the Federal Election Commission in that case specifically for the purpose of reviewing the results of this election. It was made up of people from the House of Representatives, from the Senate, from the Supreme Court, and they reviewed the case and voted on which results to certify from those southern states, and that the vote was split strictly down party lines. All the Republicans voted for the Republican candidate, all the Democrats voted for the Democratic candidate, but the Federal Election Commission had more Republicans than Democrats. So even though Tilden had initially won both the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, that result was thrown out. Rutherford B. Hayes ended up winning the presidency that year by a single vote. And in exchange, knowing that the southern states would be furious about this outcome, in exchange, the Republican Party agreed to end Reconstruction, remove the last of the federal troops that were occupying southern states, and bring the Reconstruction era to an end, allow all the states to return to normal civil government. I mean, that, when you think about contested presidential elections, that one seems to me to be about as crazy as they get, as they come.
Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today and give us kind of this historical background that I think a lot of people, including myself, don't know. I don't remember, learning about the details of these elections when I was in school. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
I'm happy to do it. It's always fun to talk a little history.
That was Eric Hinderrocker, Distinguished Professor of History. For more information about the College of Humanities, please visit humanities.utah.edu and don't forget to vote.